Most gardeners never question this trick. Why would they? It kills the bugs. The leaves stay green. The plants keep growing. Everything looks exactly the way it should. And that's precisely what made one research team suspicious. They placed 2 tomato plants side by side. Same variety, same soil, same fertilizer, same sunlight. Samekade. Weeks later, both plants still looked almost identical. Until harvest day. One produced nearly twice as many tomatoes. The other looked perfectly healthy, but quietly fell behind. If that's possible, then the biggest threat to your harvest may not be the insects you can see. It might be the solution you've trusted for years. And once the researchers discovered why, they stopped looking at gardening advice the same way ever again. The first guess was soil. It almost always is. So they tested it. Nothing unusual. Then fertilizer. Maybe one plant was getting too much nitrogen. The numbers didn't agree. Sunlight? They measured that too. Water? Roots? Even the seed variety. Every answer that normally explains a disappointing harvest quietly disappeared. And something even stranger started happening. The more variables they removed, the less this looked like a gardening problem. It looked like a blind spot, the kind you can stare at for years without ever seeing, because the only thing left wasn't hidden in the soil. It wasn't growing on the plant. It wasn't crawling across the leaves. It was already sitting on the shelf in millions of homes. By now, almost everyone in the room believed they had the answer. Dish soap. It was the only variable left. And honestly, it made perfect sense. Anyone who has ever sprayed it on aphids knows what happens. Within minutes, the insects stop moving. The leaves look cleaner. The plant looks healthier. For a brief moment, the mystery seemed over. But one of the researchers kept staring at the harvest table. Something felt wrong. If dish soap was the whole story, why did the struggling plant still look so healthy? Its leaves hadn't curled. Its stems hadn't weakened. New flowers were still opening. Nothing about it looked like a plant in trouble. And that's exactly what made this experiment so unsettling. The problem wasn't hiding in plain sight. It was hiding behind something that looked completely normal. From that moment on, the investigation stopped asking, "Does dish soap kill bugs?" Instead, it asked a much stranger question. What happens after the bugs are gone, that almost nobody is paying attention to? Something about the results refused to settle. So instead of searching for another explanation, the researchers changed the question. Not, which plant looks healthier, but what has this plant quietly given up? The notebooks came back out. Tape measures stretched across stems. Leaf after leaf was compared. Flower clusters were counted twice. The first tomatoes ripened almost side by side. Every new observation pushed the mystery in the wrong direction. Nothing looked different. And that was becoming impossible to ignore. For a moment, someone laughed. Maybe there had never been a problem. Maybe everyone had spent weeks chasing a story that didn't exist. Then one researcher paused over a single leaf. It looked perfectly ordinary. No burns. No yellow edges. No curling. Nothing a gardener would ever worry about. But appearances can be surprisingly expensive. Some changes happen so quietly, they never become visible at all. The plant survives. It keeps growing. It even keeps producing flowers. Yet somewhere inside, a different set of decisions may already be unfolding. No dramatic collapse. No obvious warning. Just tiny trade-offs. Repeated hundreds of times. Then a digital scale appeared on the table. No debate. No announcement. Just one simple measurement. The plants were cut, separated, bagged, labeled. Every leaf, every stem, every developing fruit, everything the plant had managed to turn sunlight into. The room grew strangely quiet, because for the first time, the investigation stopped asking, "Does this plant look healthy?" and started asking, "What has this plant quietly given up to look this healthy?" The scale was about to answer one question, but it was also about to create a much bigger one. When the final numbers were recorded, no one reached for another explanation. There were no dying leaves, no black spots, no scorched edges, nothing that looked like failure. Only 2 harvest baskets, one comfortably full, the other missing just enough tomatoes to feel strangely ordinary. Imagine picking fruit every weekend and leaving one tomato behind. Next week, another, then another. Not because you forgot them, because the plant never had the energy to grow them. That's how most harvests disappear. not in a single disaster, but through dozens of invisible decisions the plant quietly makes for itself. When a plant experiences unnecessary stress, it doesn't always look sick. It simply starts spending more energy staying alive, and a little less energy building fruit. One flower never opens. One cucumber stops growing. One pepper stays smaller than expected. Nothing dramatic, nothing worth remembering, until harvest day, and suddenly, one basket feels lighter than it should. That's what unsettled the researchers most. The healthiest-looking plant wasn't necessarily the most productive one. And once that idea takes root, every perfectly green leaf starts raising a different question. Not, does this plant look healthy? But, what has this plant quietly given up to look this healthy? If that question feels uncomfortable, what came next surprised even experienced growers. At this point, it's almost impossible not to jump to the obvious conclusion. Never use soap again. That sounds reasonable. It also happens to be where many gardeners stop asking questions. The researchers didn't. Instead, they placed 4 bottles side by side. Dish soap, insecticidal soap, potassium soap, Castile soap. From a few feet away, they looked almost interchangeable. Same clear liquid, similar labels, similar bubbles. Most people would never think twice. But that assumption hides the entire story. One bottle was created to strip grease from a dinner plate. Another was created to touch living leaves without stripping away more than necessary. They may look almost identical in your hand, while behaving very differently on a plant. And confusing the two doesn't usually kill a tomato. It simply asks the plant to spend a little more energy recovering, and a little less energy producing fruit. Suddenly, the experiment wasn't really about soap anymore. It was about chemistry. 2 gardeners can mix liquids that look almost the same, spray on the same afternoon, watch the same aphids disappear, and still carry home very different harvest baskets weeks later. Because the biggest difference was never what they sprayed. It was what that bottle had been designed to do. And once you realize that, another question quietly appears. If tomatoes can absorb the cost of a small mistake without showing obvious damage, what happens to plants that are even less forgiving? Most gardeners expect stress to announce itself. Yellow leaves, burned edges, wilted stems. Something obvious that says, something is wrong. Cucumbers rarely work that way. Stand beside one on a warm afternoon. The vine is still climbing. The leaves still look fresh. Tiny tendrils are still reaching for the trellis. Everything appears perfectly normal, because every plant follows the same rule. Survive first. Produce fruit second, long before a leaf changes color. Something almost invisible may already be changing. Water that once gathered in tiny beads now spreads across the surface. The leaf loses moisture a little faster. The plant quietly starts spending more energy protecting itself. You won't notice it walking past, but the plant notices. Every single hour. So it begins making small decisions. Grow another cucumber, or repair stressed tissue. Open another flower, or conserve resources for tomorrow. The choice is silent, and it happens hundreds of times. One flower opens, then quietly drops. One cucumber stays the size of your thumb. Another simply stops getting bigger. No warning, no drama. Nothing that makes you stop and look twice. Yet by harvest day, those invisible decisions become empty space in the basket. That's why experienced growers don't judge a plant by how green it looks. They judge it by whether it's still investing in tomorrow. Because every plant has a hidden budget. Every unnecessary stress spends a little of it. And by the time you notice the missing harvest, the plant has already been making those decisions for weeks. Watch 2 gardeners discover the same cluster of insects. The first reaches for a spray bottle. The second looks past the insects. They turn over a leaf, not to count the pests, but to see who's already hunting them. A ladybug larva, almost invisible. A hoofdvlieg, a tiny parasitic wasp. Life quietly solving the problem before a human ever needs to. Most gardens are far busier than they appear. Predators, pollinators, microbes, fungi, thousands of tiny partnerships happening at the same time. One unnecessary spray doesn't only touch the insect you wanted to remove. It interrupts conversations you never knew were happening. That's why experienced gardeners sometimes walk away without doing anything. Not because they ignore problems, because they recognize a solution already in progress. From the outside, it looks like patience. In reality, It's trust built on observation. And season after season, those invisible partnerships often produce something no bottle can promise. A garden that becomes more resilient instead of more dependent. Once you notice that, you stop asking, how do I kill this insect? And start asking, what is the rest of the garden trying to do? By now, the missing tomatoes no longer feel mysterious, but the way they disappeared still does. No storm carried them away. No disease erased them. No swarm of insects stripped the vines overnight. The harvest slipped away one quiet decision at a time. One unnecessary spray. One leaf forced to recover instead of grow. One flower that never became fruit. Too small to notice. Too ordinary to remember. That's the part most gardeners never see. Nature keeps a running total. Not on a calendar. Not in a notebook. Inside the plant itself. A little extra stress today. A little less growth tomorrow. A little less energy for the next cluster of flowers. Each choice feels insignificant on its own. Together, they become an emptier harvest basket. And that's why experienced gardeners chase something very different. Not spotless leaves. Not perfect plants. A garden that solves more problems before they ever need solving. They walk slower. Spray less. Watch longer. Trust the system they've built. From the outside, it almost looks like they're doing nothing. But every season, their harvest tells a different story. Maybe abundance isn't created by adding another product. Maybe it's created by making fewer interruptions. And once you begin seeing a garden that way, you stop asking, what should I spray next? And start asking, what happens if I leave this alone for one more day? At the beginning of this story, there were only 2 tomato plants. They shared the same soil, the same sunlight, the same fertilizer, the same care. Yet one quietly left part of its harvest behind. It would be easy to blame the soap. It would also miss the larger lesson. Every garden is constantly making thousands of tiny decisions. Some belong to us. Most belong to nature. The most successful gardeners aren't the ones who control every outcome. They're the ones who know which outcomes never needed controlling. That's why a healthy garden doesn't always look busy. Sometimes the smartest choice is to wait one more day. Watch one more leaf. Leave one more insect alone. Because once you start measuring harvest instead of activity, everything changes. And maybe that's the hidden cost no label ever mentions. Not damaged leaves, not burned edges, but the quiet loss of a harvest that never had the chance to exist. So now I'm curious, where are you gardening from? And what's one gardening rule you've completely changed your mind about? Maybe it was something your parents taught you. Maybe something your grandfather always believed. Or maybe it was a mistake that cost you an entire season. Leave your state and your story below. I read every one of them. And if there's one thing this experiment reminded me, it's that some of the best gardening lessons don't come from bottles. They come from gardeners willing to share what nature taught them.